All right, what's up guys? So recently I made a video about a guy who made 28 apps and made 10K per month, and everyone loves this story. 28 apps in 8 months, from a couple $100 to 10 grand a month, built on nights and weekends. There's no big launch, no big bet, just speed. You know, it sounds clean, almost too clean, and that's exactly where people get stuck, and that's why I'm making this video. Because when stories like this travel online, they slowly lose the parts that actually matter, the parts that explain why this worked here and why it doesn't translate cleanly from most people watching. So this video isn't about tearing the story down, it's about putting the missing pieces back in. So if you've been watching SaaS and indie hacker content for a while, you've probably noticed a pattern, which is fast shipping stories, portfolio plays, just build more end quote narratives, and they're not fake, but they're kind of incomplete. And what's missing is context, not tactics, not tools, just context. The kind of context you only notice when you've shipped things yourself and realize that copying the headline doesn't recreate the outcome, guys. So let's slow the story down and look at what is underneath it. So why is the headline misleading, even if it is true? Guys, 28 apps in 8 months is a real number. $10,000 per month is a real number, but numbers like that hide more than they can explain. Here's the first thing that usually gets glossed over. Speed is not the strategy, leverage is. Most people hear this story and walk away thinking the edge was speed, which is ship faster, lower standards, move on quicker. But speed was not the advantage, it was actually leverage. This wasn't someone learning how to build apps from scratch while shipping. This was someone with nearly a decade of platform specific experience, and that matters more than people want to admit. Not because beginners can't succeed, but because repetition only compounds when the base is already there. Guys, shipping 28 apps as a senior mobile engineer is not the same thing as shipping 28 apps as someone learning the ecosystem for the first time. It's the same number, but a different reality. And I'm just being honest with you guys, speed without leverage just creates more half-finished things. And another thing is tiny bets still require direction. Another part of the story that gets oversimplified is the ideas of tiny bets. It sounds like randomness, built a lot of things, let the market decide, don't get attached. But if you look closely, there weren't random ideas. They lived inside the same ecosystem, the same distribution surface, the same mental model of how users search, download, and pay. That's not luck. This guy had pattern recognition. And most founders who try to copy this part skip the unsexy middle, which is learning how one platform actually behaves over time. And without that, a quote unquote portfolio of bets turns into a folder of apps no one opens. So this is the hidden cost of quote unquote just move on. One of the most repeated lines in stories like this, guys, is once the app is live, just let it go. And I know that line sounds freeing, and it's almost where a lot of people quietly fail, but moving on is only safe if feedback loops exist. So letting go works when you can tell signal from noise, you understand what early data actually means, you know when not to move on. And most people don't move on strategically, they move on emotionally. I know a lot of you guys watching this have done that before. You guys ship, nothing happens, you assume it failed, and then you start over. And I'll be honest, that's not portfolio thinking. That's kind of like avoidance dressed up as discipline. And I don't know if you guys remember, but in the original story, moving on worked because there was a clear system for noticing which apps were stabilized versus sinking. And that part rarely survives the retelling. And another thing is the 80-20 rule cuts both ways, guys. So yes, 4 apps produced most of the revenue. And that sounds encouraging for new people. But the other side of that rule is rarely mentioned, which is most things will do almost nothing. You know, people hear 28 apps and imagine steady progress, but in reality, it's a lot of quiet weeks where nothing spikes, nothing trends, and nothing feels validated. So if you're not prepared for that silence, volume becomes exhausted instead of empowering. And that's just one of the many things that was brushed over in that last video. So this is why the approach breaks for many founders. Zooming out, the story fits into a larger pattern across SaaS YouTube content. The same structure shows up again and again. High output, clean numbers, clear hindsight narrative, but what is missing is execution friction. The tools didn't create the outcome. Guys, a lot of attention gets placed on the stack, which is AI tools, templates, reusable components, and they help, but they don't create judgment. They don't tell you which features to ignore, when polish actually does matter, when early revenue is misleading. And most founders don't fail because they like tools, they fail because they misread feedback. And this approach works only when someone already knows which signals are worth listening to and which ones to ignore completely. And another quiet gap in this story is also distribution and marketing. App stores are not neutral environments. They reward certain behaviors, they punish others. They have momentum curves that only make sense once you've watched enough launches play out. And from the outside, it looks like, okay, ship fast and and the store does the rest and gives you momentum. But from the inside, it looks more like ship fast inside a system you already understand deeply. And that difference changes everything, guys, because when you zoom out across hundreds of founders who try to replicate stories like this, a few patterns show up. Pattern one is beginners over index on volume. They hear, 28 apps and think, okay, the lesson is quantity. So a lot of you guys are rushing, you guys skip clarity, you guys confuse motion with progress, but volume only works when the learning loop is tight. Otherwise, it's just burnout with better branding as shipping fast. So pattern two is experienced builders underestimate their edge. And on the flip side, people with a real experience often downplay it. You hear in these YouTube videos, they say things like, anyone could do this. It's just shipping. It's not that complex. And they actually forget how much judgment they're applying automatically. That gap between perception and reality is why these stories feel so repeatable until someone tries. And then the final pattern, 3, is stories compress time. Guys, 8 months becomes a montage. Failures blur things together. Learning curves flatten out. And what looks like momentum was often months of calibration that never make it into the script. That doesn't make the story dishonest. It just kind of makes it incomplete. And if there's one thing this story really shows, it's beneath the hype, it's this. Shipping is not the scale, interpretation is. Knowing what to build is one problem, and knowing what to ignore is harder. So knowing when something is quietly working versus truly dead is the hardest part. That's the part that doesn't fit into a YouTube thumbnail or title or hook of a YouTube video. It only shows up after you've shipped enough things to be wrong many times. I know a lot of founders are watching this video and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyways, despite all of this, these stories keep spreading on YouTube, and there's a reason. They point to something real. They challenge the myth that one perfect app is the only part. They push back against over polishing. They remind people that momentum matters, but taken without context, they create a false expectation, and false expectations don't just slow people down, they also confuse them. So something I want you guys to take away from this without copying the narrative is this isn't a warning to stop shipping. It's just a reminder to understand what kind of shipping you're doing. Are you exploring? Are you validating? Are you compounding something that you already understand? Those are very different modes. They just look the same on the surface. And most frustration from SaaS comes from using the right behavior in the wrong phase. And that divide is some people watching stories like this are just learning. They're absorbing ideas. They're building mental models. And others are already shipping, already launching, already stuck in cycles that feel productive but don't compound. And those two groups hear the same story very differently. One hears inspiration, the other hears discomfort. And that discomfort is usually a signal that the story is wrong, but that something important is missing from their current approach. So this is where it leaves you guys. If this story made you feel energized, curious, or motivated, that's good. That's a good thing. It did its job. If it made you feel confused, skeptical, or quietly frustrated, that's also useful. And that reaction usually means you're past the surface layer level and you're no longer asking, can this work? You're asking, why isn't this working for me? And that's a very different question. So guys, the danger isn't believing these stories. The danger is really stopping at the headline. Every clean outcome hides messy execution, and every fast win sits on top of slow understanding. And every simple system is simple because someone already did the hard thinking. And once you see that, these stories stop being instructions and start being mirrors. So some people watching this are just learning, others are already building and stuck. And if you're in the second group, there's a link below. That's it for today's video. Have a good one, guys.